Earlier this week, a small farming town in California's Imperial Valley got hit with roughly a dozen and a half earthquakes in a single overnight stretch, and not one of them was a main shock, because there wasn't one to point to. That missing main shock is the whole story. It's the fingerprint of something seismologists call a swarm. This particular swarm broke out at arguably the single most watched address in the state, right at the southern doorstep of the San Andreas Fault, a stretch of ground that hasn't ruptured in a major earthquake in more than 300 years. The same patch of ground did something very similar back in May, and it fizzled out then too. So let's walk through exactly what happened, and why the location matters so much more than the size of any individual shake, and the specific concrete signals scientists are actually watching right now to figure out which way this one breaks. It started just after midnight this week beneath Brawley, California. At 12:14 in the morning, the ground about 7 kilometers south of the city cracked with a magnitude 3.1 earthquake at a depth of roughly 10.5 kilometers. On its own, that would never make the news. Small earthquakes happen across Southern California constantly. But 17 minutes later at 12:31 a.m., a magnitude 3.6, the strongest of the sequence so far, struck almost the exact same spot, just slightly deeper. Around 1:58 that morning, a magnitude 3.4 followed in the same location, and they kept coming after that. By sunrise, monitoring networks had logged well over a dozen additional small earthquakes layered on top of those first three, most in the magnitude 1 to 3 range, all clustered in essentially the same patch of crust. Around 36 people scattered across Brawley, Holtville, and Heber, along with some residents just across the border in Mexico, felt that magnitude 3.6, strongly enough to file reports with the U.S. Geological Survey. There were no injuries and no reported damage. Here's what makes this pattern genuinely different from an ordinary earthquake sequence. There was no single big jolt followed by a tail of shrinking aftershocks. There was no main shock at all. Instead, there was a cluster of events all roughly similar in size, arriving in an irregular, stuttering rhythm with no one earthquake clearly in charge of the sequence. That behavior has a name among seismologists. They call it a swarm, and swarms genuinely do not follow the rules most people assume apply to earthquakes. The reason this modest cluster is worth paying attention to has almost nothing to do with the earthquakes themselves and everything to do with where they happened. This particular patch of ground sits at the doorstep of arguably the most dangerous quiet fault in the entire country, the stretch of the San Andreas that hasn't produced a major rupture in over 3 centuries. Every time this doorstep starts trembling, the scientists who study these faults for a living stop what they're doing and look north. The place all of this is happening is called the Brawley Seismic Zone, and it's genuinely one of the busiest patches of crust anywhere in California. To understand why a swarm is fundamentally different from a normal earthquake sequence, when most people picture an earthquake, they picture one big jolt, followed by a string of progressively weaker aftershocks, fading away over hours and days, the standard script from a single fault surface breaking and gradually settling down. A swarm doesn't work that way. In a swarm, you get dozens or even hundreds of earthquakes clustered tightly together in space and time, with none of them clearly dominating the rest, switching on and off in bursts that can stretch across days or weeks. This week's magnitude of 3.6 was never a main shock. It was simply the largest event so far. What drives a swarm tends to be different too. A normal main shock is fundamentally a stress problem. Crust builds up strain gradually until a fault finally snaps. A swarm is usually more of a fluid problem instead, water migrating slowly through cracks in the rock, changing the pressure, acting on a whole network of small faults, and letting them slip a little at a time. That's exactly why swarms tend to ignore the usual statistical patterns of decay. They can stall out completely and then restart without warning, because the underlying driver isn't a single broken fault gradually relaxing. It's fluid moving through a fractured system, and fluid can start and stop in ways a single fault rupture simply can't. That distinction matters practically. In a normal sequence, once the big one has happened, the worst is statistically behind you. In a swarm, you never really get that reassurance, because there's no clean main shock to point to in the rearview mirror. The largest event of this sequence might have already happened this week, or it might still be building. If this week felt oddly familiar to people living around Brawley, it should have. This isn't the first time this patch of ground has behaved this way, and it's not even the first time this year. Back in May, the same underlying structure produced a considerably larger swarm. It began with a barely noticeable magnitude, 1. 6 several miles beneath the city climbed through a magnitude 3. The 5 that same afternoon and peaked just after midnight with a magnitude 4. 7 strong enough to wake people up and generate felt reports as far away as San Diego, well over 200 kilometers from the epicenter. By the time that swarm wound down, monitoring agencies had cataloged several hundred separate earthquakes, and the city of Brawley activated its emergency operations center before eventually shifting to lighter virtual monitoring once the activity settled. The May swarm is genuinely the key to reading this latest one. because it shows exactly what this structure is capable of producing when conditions line up. The same buried fault system also lit up in the winter of 2016 and early 2017, meaning the same structure has now reactivated across multiple separate episodes spanning roughly a decade. Swarms restarting on the same fault system across months and years is well documented, well understood behavior for this particular zone. But every restart resets the one question nobody can reliably answer in advance. Where exactly does this particular sequence eventually top out? The wider neighborhood around Brawley has a considerably longer track record, and it tells you roughly where the practical ceiling sits. Back in 2012, a swarm just north of this week's location produced two separate earthquakes above magnitude 5, a 5.3 and a 5. A 5, along with hundreds of smaller shocks, causing minor damage around Brawley at the time. In 1981, the Westmoreland earthquake reached magnitude 5. 8, though that event behaved more like a conventional main shock followed by aftershocks rather than a pure swarm. In 2020, another swarm centered near Westmoreland grew active enough that the Geological Survey issued a formal aftershock forecast before activity settled back down, with more than 60 earthquakes above magnitude 3 recorded during that episode. Put together, that gives a rough working ceiling for swarm-type sequences in this zone, somewhere in the neighborhood of magnitude 5.5. Big enough to break windows and crack plaster, but historically not the kind of event that levels an entire region on its own. To understand why anyone living north of Brawley should genuinely care, you have to look at what this seismic zone actually connects to. The Brawley Seismic Zone functions almost like a geological junction box, the specific place where the northern end of the Imperial Fault hands off plate motion to the southern end of the San Andreas Fault near the bottom of the Salton Sea. When the Brawley Zone shakes, it's shaking right at the base of the San Andreas itself. And the specific stretch of the San Andreas that begins there happens to be the segment that genuinely keeps seismologists up at night. The southernmost San Andreas, running along the northeastern shore of the Salton Sea past a small community called Bombay Beach and up toward the Coachella Valley and greater Los Angeles beyond it. That section has a real problem. The problem is silence. It hasn't produced a major earthquake in at least 300 years. Detailed trenching studies published in 2011, based on digging across the fault and carefully dating disturbed soil layers, worked out a chronology showing this section tends to rupture on average roughly every 180 years. Run that math, and this section of fault isn't simply due for another rupture. It's genuinely well past due by that historical average. So when a swarm fires off right near the connection point feeding into that fault, the question basically writes itself. Could the small earthquakes rattling this doorstep somehow give the much larger sleeping fault next door the nudge it eventually needs to finally let go? That remains a legitimately open scientific question rather than something settled confidently in either direction. The honest answer is that the underlying mechanism is real, but it's weak, and distance matters enormously. Earthquakes do change the stress acting on nearby faults, but a magnitude 3 or 4 event only does this meaningfully across a range of a few kilometers at most. This week's swarm sits roughly 60 kilometers south of that fault terminus, close enough to keep the underlying question alive, but far enough away that the actual stress it's adding to the San Andreas itself remains genuinely small, considerably smaller than if this same activity were happening right at Bombay Beach instead. In documented cases from around the world, a small handful of earthquake swarms have gone on to precede much larger earthquakes nearby. The overwhelming majority simply don't. They rise, sputter for a while, and fade back into background activity. The single most probable outcome for this sequence is that it behaves essentially the way the May swarm did, climbing for a while, maybe producing something in the magnitude 4 range, rattling some windows, and gradually dying out over the coming days to weeks without producing anything larger. That's the base case, and it's where the smart money sits. Across earthquakes worldwide, only somewhere between roughly 5 and 10% of moderate shocks turn out in hindsight to have been foreshocks, preceding something considerably larger. And there's no reliable way to identify a foreshock in advance. It only earns that label retroactively after the larger earthquake shows up. Until then, it's statistically indistinguishable from the thousands of other earthquakes that lead to nothing at all. It also helps to keep in mind what the genuinely proven, documented hazard around this region actually looks like, because it isn't the swarm itself. The faults connected to the Brawley Zone carry a real, well-documented history of destructive earthquakes. The Imperial Valley produced twin magnitude 6.2 earthquakes about an hour apart back in 1915. The El Centro earthquake of 1940 reached roughly magnitude 6.9 on the Imperial Fault. 1979 brought a magnitude 6.5 to that same valley, injuring dozens of people. 1987 delivered a magnitude 6.0 near Superstition Hills. In 2010, the El Mayorga Capa earthquake, striking just across the border in Mexico, reached magnitude 7.2. Those are the events genuinely capable of damaging buildings and hurting people in this region. The swarm activity is more of a noisy symptom. Those larger, well-documented faults are the real reason residents throughout this valley keep an earthquake kit ready in the closet. Still, there's a legitimate reason to keep watching this specific zone closely. This is genuinely the one place in California where the Geological Survey has an actual operational protocol allowing it to publicly raise the estimated odds of a San Andreas rupture in something close to real time. There's a genuine unresolved mystery sitting underneath this entire story, too, and it's worth pausing on because it may be the most interesting part. The noisiest patch of crust in Southern California sits directly at the foot of arguably the quietest major fault in the entire state. The Brawley Zone swarms, pauses, and restarts almost continuously across the years, while the southern San Andreas, sitting just a few dozen kilometers away, has done essentially nothing for 3 full centuries. And it's that quiet fault, not the noisy zone, that carries the real potential to hurt people. Researchers have a leading theory for why that section has stayed silent for so unusually long, and it involves a lake that no longer really exists in its historical form. For thousands of years, the Salton Trough was periodically filled by an enormous ancient body of water known as Lake Coahuila, far larger than today's shrinking Salton Sea. Research published in 2023 found that the last several major ruptures along the southernmost San Andreas each appeared to line up closely with periods when that ancient lake was full. The sheer weight of all that water may have acted almost like a natural trigger, helping the fault release its built-up strain on a somewhat more regular schedule throughout history. That lake has been largely gone for centuries now, and that absence may be exactly why the fault's internal clock appears to have slowed down so dramatically. Here's the unsettling part of that theory. If the ancient lake was actually helping this fault release its accumulated strain on schedule, losing the lake never made the fault any safer. It simply removed one of its natural triggers. The underlying strain has kept quietly accumulating this entire time, with several meters of it now believed to sit within that section of fault. Ongoing silence is not the same thing as safety. It looks a lot more like a loaded spring with its safety catch stuck in place. The clearest historical precedent for how seriously scientists take a swarm in this area comes from September 2016, when activity broke out right at Bombay Beach, essentially at the fault's terminus itself. That swarm, roughly 100 earthquakes topping out around magnitude 4. 3 happened right on top of the fault. And because of that, the Geological Survey did something it almost never does. It ran the underlying probability numbers in real time and publicly raised the estimated odds of a magnitude 7 or larger earthquake striking the southern San Andreas within the following week to as high as 1 in 100. For context, the normal background odds in any given week typically sit around 1 in 6,000, meaning that represented roughly a 100-fold jump. California's Office of Emergency Services issued a formal earthquake advisory for a few days, and the state was genuinely, openly bracing for the possibility. Then nothing happened. The swarm faded, the elevated odds decayed back toward background levels within about a week, and the advisory quietly lapsed without incident. That outcome wasn't a failure of the science. It was the science working exactly as intended. A 1 in 100 chance still means nothing happens, 99 times out of 100. The reason those odds spiked so dramatically in 2016 and would likely be considerably lower for this week's activity comes down to that one governing variable, distance to the fault terminus. Bombay Beach sat right on top of it. This week's swarm sits roughly 60 kilometers away. There's one more piece of this story worth addressing directly because it's likely already circulating online in a misleading way. On the same day as this week's Brawley swarm, roughly 3 hours later, a genuinely rare magnitude 5.0 earthquake struck the Texas Panhandle about 23 miles southeast of the small town of Spearman. Reportedly the strongest earthquake to hit that specific region in at least a century, with shaking felt as far as Oklahoma City, Tulsa, and southwestern Kansas. Posts began circulating online within hours, claiming the two events were somehow connected, implying some kind of continental scale link. That claim doesn't hold up. These two earthquakes were roughly 3 hours apart, not simultaneous, and occurred more than 1,700 kilometers apart from each other. The stress that one earthquake can meaningfully transfer to another fault fades away within just a few kilometers for a magnitude 3 or 4 event, and within a few dozen kilometers, even for something closer to magnitude 5. There's no known physical mechanism connecting a swarm in California to a moderate earthquake in Texas that far away. What you're actually looking at is simple coincidence. This planet produces roughly 150 earthquakes of magnitude, 4.5 or greater every single week worldwide, and 2 unusual events happening on the same general day is not evidence of a hidden pattern. It's what ordinary randomness looks like at a global scale. The Texas earthquake is its own separate, genuinely interesting story tied to a region where earthquake activity has been rising for other reasons entirely, but it has nothing to do with what happened near Brawley. So here's what scientists are actually watching right now to determine whether this week is background noise or the early stage of something more serious. There are essentially three signals, and anyone can track them. The first is magnitude. If this swarm eventually climbs past May's peak of 4.7, and especially if it pushes anywhere close to this zone's historical swarm ceiling of roughly magnitude 5.5, that meaningfully changes the underlying risk picture, since a magnitude 5. 5 releases roughly 700 times more energy than this week's magnitude 3.6. Events climbing, rather than gradually fading, is the first genuine signal worth watching for. The second signal is direction. Pay attention to where the earthquakes are actually moving. If activity stays contained beneath Brawley itself, that remains the reassuring scenario. If it instead starts migrating north toward Westmoreland, toward the geothermal field, and especially toward Bombay Beach and the San Andreas terminus itself, that's the scenario that genuinely matters most, since that's exactly the direction that would carry a swarm from 60 kilometers away into the kind of situation seen back in 2016. Location is everything with this particular hazard, and northward migration is the single most important thing to track. The third signal is official confirmation. If the Geological Survey issues a formal aftershock forecast, or the state issues a genuine earthquake advisory, the way both happened in 2016 and again during the 2020 Westmoreland swarm, that's the clear cue that professionals have already run the real-time numbers and decided the underlying odds have shifted enough to say so publicly. Bringing this back to where it started, this week, the ground beneath Brawley began shaking again in that same stuttering, no main shock rhythm it produced back in May and in 2016 before that. The most likely outcome, by a wide margin, is that it does exactly what it's done every one of those previous times. It rises, rattles a little, and gradually fades out over the coming days without producing anything larger than a moderate earthquake. If you live in that area, the realistic thing to prepare for is a few more restless nights, not some looming catastrophe. But the reason any of this remains genuinely worth watching isn't really the swarm itself. It's the much larger fault sitting right next door, the southernmost San Andreas, silent for more than 3 centuries, carrying several meters of quietly stored strain, sitting roughly 60 kilometers from a patch of ground that simply will not stop trembling. Science can reasonably estimate the odds that any given swarm nudges that larger fault awake, and right now those odds remain low. What science genuinely cannot yet explain is why the most heavily loaded section of arguably the most famous fault on the planet has managed to stay so remarkably still while everything immediately around it keeps shaking, or which swarm, if any, eventually ends that long silence for good.